We are so happy that you could join us today. We are so excited about tonight's topic. We have a wonderful speaker, one of Westfield's own, who has aspired to become a doctor in his field of profession, and we are so excited to have him. Today we have with us Dr. Joseph Graves Jr. He is the professor of biological science in the Department of Biology in at the University of North Carolina A&T State University. He comes with a wealth of knowledge. He has been recognized as one of the outstanding graduates from his alma mater in biology. He's also been recognized as the Innovator of the Year by U.S. Black Engineering Magazine. His research has been published in several publications, as well as his own books when he talks about nanomaterials. He has two recent books that he published this year that we're very excited for him to talk a bit about, and one in particular that we all really want to think about and look at potentially purchasing for ourselves. It's called Race and Racism: Answers to Frequently Asked Questions. He'll tell us a little bit about that during what his discussion. He also leads a lot of programs to address underrepresentation of minorities in science. So we are so excited to have you with us, Dr. Graves, and for you to take the time out to present to us, to talk a little bit about the pandemic, the vaccinations for the pandemic, and how our community is impacted by these based off our historical interactions with these types of things, and how that plays into our thinking today, and how we can actually change that to move forward and keep ourselves healthy. So we are so glad to have you. Welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Before I begin my remarks, I would like to give thanks to the one who made all this knowledge possible. I will bless the Lord, who giveth me counsel. My heart teacheth me night after night. I have set the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand. I shall not fall.
Amen, amen.
That's Psalm 16. So this year has been quite the set of events, which, I sensed and knew a long time ago that I was called to do specific work. And this year demonstrated that that work was necessary. We as a people face two existential crises. The first beginning in the summer with the murder of George Floyd, and then the second with the coming of this pandemic. And I felt necessary to take action to deal with both of these crises. So to deal with the George Floyd situation, I completed the book with my colleague Alan Goodman, Race and Racism: Answers to Frequently Asked Questions. And the idea behind this book was to provide people with the information they needed to dispel these long-standing misconceptions about these topics in American society. The second book that I completed in December, you can see on the background behind me, is my book called Antimicrobial Nanomaterials: Principles and Applications. That's a book for professional scientists and particularly material scientists. And I felt compelled to write this book because, quite frankly, the research that's going on to attempt to control these infectious organisms is structured incorrectly. And so I came out with a book to explain to people how they should be doing this research correctly. And so I'm going to first talk about the Race and Racism book, and then I'll tell you and answer some questions about the pandemic and how we can better protect ourselves. So I'm going to start then. This is actually a presentation that I gave at the New Brunswick Theological Seminary this last Saturday, in which I talked about the book in the context of what aspiring ministers needed to know about this subject. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about this, and then we can move on to discuss things concerning SARS coronavirus 2. So for those of you that don't know my past work, I began to think about why people thought racially in the late 90s. And the result of that thinking was the publication of my first book, The Emperor's New Clothes, Biological Theories of Race at the Millennium, which was published by Rutgers University Press. Again, that New Jersey connection coming to the forefront back in 2001. Now, I wrote a revision of the book in 2005. The Emperor's New Clothes teaches people how and why we began to think racially in the Western world. And it goes back to the ancients, including the thinking of the Hebrews, the Greeks, and the Romans about human variation, and demonstrated that these ideas about race really occur coincidental with the transatlantic slave trade. So in other words, for most of human history, people didn't think racially. This was something that was developed in concert with the enslavement of Africans, the movement of 11 million enslaved people to the Western Hemisphere, the institutionalization of chattel slavery, and racial supremacy in the Western world. Now, the second book, which was written, first edition was written in 2004, The Race Myth, assumes that you know this history of where racial thinking came from, and it goes on to outline the ongoing pathologies that were occurring in American society because people continued to think racially. Now, I hate to say it, but back in 2005, I predicted all of the stuff that we saw unfold between 2016 and 2020. At that time, it was as clear to me as the nose on my face where the society was going and what the future was going to hold if we did not dismantle this racial ideology that was running the United States. Now, honestly, after I wrote The Race Myth, I really hoped that I would never have to write another book about race again. But in fact, the things that I predicted were happening. And both I and my colleague, Alan Goodman, back in 2019, began to realize that there was a need to come up with a simple set of answers to these frequently asked questions and misconceptions that people held about race and racism. And so we went to work on this book, which is coming out in October of 2021, Race and Racism, Answers to Frequently Asked Questions. Now, for those of you who need resources that aren't books, there are some excellent examples that I list here on the slide. The website, Race, Are We So Different, is associated with the race exhibit, which was designed by the American Association of Anthropologists. The race exhibit moves around to museums all over the country. It so happens right now that it's located in Raleigh, North Carolina. And I am on the committee involved in making sure that this exhibit gets out to the people, particularly during COVID. So they've actually developed virtual tours that you can take online of this exhibit. So if you go to the Raleigh Museum of Natural History, you can literally walk your way through the race exhibit without coming down here to Raleigh. There are also this collection of essays from the Social Science Research Council, and still the film, the documentary film, Race, Power of an Illusion, a 3-part documentary from California Newsreel, even though it was filmed in the spring of 2003, is still the best documentary on this subject. Now, you should be aware, in case you get frightened, when you see part one, you're going to see a much younger version of me in part one. Okay. And quite frankly, I ran part one in that film. Now, the good news is that we are hoping to redo Race, Power of the Illusion and bring it up to date in 2021. Now, much of what I talked about in that film was before the Human Genome Project had completed. And so there were things that we didn't know. Now, none of the new data changed any of the conclusions that we made, but in fact, it more powerfully reinforced what we said in 2003. So we're thinking of redoing the documentary and releasing it. And so as plans for the refilming come about, I will let people know. Now, another resource that you should make sure is in all of your high schools and all of your colleges is the Encyclopedia of Race and Racism, the second edition. Now, I was the editor for all the entries on anthropology, evolution, and genetics for this encyclopedia. It is a powerful reference tool that will give you answers to virtually anything you ever thought about on the subject of race and racism quickly by going to an entry in the encyclopedia. Now, there is an online version of it too. So if you want to purchase that for your library, that's a lot cheaper than the actual books. So this is my co-author, good colleague, Dr. Alan Goodman. We've known each other for over 30 years. He's a past president of the American Anthropological Association. And we decided that this book was timely and necessary. And so we got to work on it together. So now, in the book, we provide concise and accessible answers, and that's the key. We write this as much as possible in non-scientific language. Now, these questions are ones that we have gathered over the years in conversations with students, educators, policymakers, friends, and family. The book is for readers who want to work towards human equity and for readers who are nervous about saying the wrong thing. Now, in some cases, these two groups overlap. You know, we didn't write this book for the people who stormed the Capitol, because we know there's nothing we can say that's going to convince them. But what we wanted to do was create a tool that would help people of faith and goodwill to address these long-standing stereotypes about race and racism, okay? Now, in particular, over the course of our career, we found that there's an ongoing confusion concerning the meaning and significance of human genetic variation, particularly in relation to disease predisposition. So my chapter 9 deals effectively with those misconceptions. So, chapter 1, definitions of what race, racism, and their relationship to human biological variation. In chapter 2, it's a summary of how racial thinking came to be and why it is still so important. In chapter 3, I discuss everything you ever wanted to know about genetics and race. Chapter 5 specifically deals with races and disease incidents. Now, again, here, I predicted once again that, infectious disease, transmissible disease would hit Black and brown communities harder than other communities, and I explained why. Chapter 6 is about aging and mortality. Chapter 7 is about athletics, bodies, and abilities. Chapter 8 is about race, brains, and behavior, in which I dismantle all of these racist conceptions of intelligence difference between people of African descent and people of European and East Asian descent. In chapter 10, I explain why you can have DNA ancestry testing at the same time. That doesn't mean that biological races exist. It simply means that we can trace the ancestry of human beings past the time that they left Africa. All right, so now, since this talk was originally written for the theological seminary, And a lot of this stuff you already know. I'm going to skip forward to stuff that I think you don't know. So now I will send this presentation to my good cousin, the esteemed Reverend Ronald Allen, so that if anybody wants to read through this, you can. All right. All right, so this is a point that I wanted to get to, the quick understanding of why we as human beings don't have biological races. So I have often been misquoted. New York Times misquoted me, the LA Times misquoted me as saying race is not a scientific concept. I've never said that. Okay, that's absolutely incorrect. I've never said that. So there are two race concepts, however. The biological race concept, which starts out historically looking at what people look like, and then moved on to where they came from. And then in the 20th century, with the development of population genetics, looked at the frequency of genes in different groups. And then later on in the 20th century, with the development of techniques to study ancestry, began to focus on whether groups could be considered unique evolutionary lineages. And so there is a biological race concept. The simple fact, however, is that if you'd apply these criteria to our species, anatomically modern humans, turns out we don't have any biological races. Now, there are species that do, and I'm going to explain and give you examples of some species that do, but our species does not. Now, this comes into stark contrast with the socially constructed or defined race concept that arbitrarily utilizes aspects of what you look like, where you came from, what culture you belong to, what language you speak, what religion you practice. But this is done in the service of a social dominance hierarchy. In other words, this concept was constructed for one purpose, that is, to oppress human beings and to determine who had rights within a society and who did not have those rights. And so it was invented for the purposes of oppressing human beings. Now, for example, in the 18th century, naturalists debated how many races there were, and depending upon which naturalist you spoke to and what their criteria were, they came to very different conclusions. So Julien Joseph de Vere thought that there were two, and I'll let you guess what those two were. André Jacquinot thought there were three. The philosopher Immanuel Kant came to the conclusion that there were four. J.F. Blumenbach, who's known to be the father of anthropology, came up with five. And Blumenbach's five race classification system still is in use in large portions of the world. Now, if we move over to people like Samuel Morton, who measured the skull volumes of human beings, human skeletons, Morton thought that there were 22 human races. Okay, the physician Edmund Burke thought there were 63. Now, the reason these people couldn't come to an agreement concerning the number of races they thought existed in the human species was because they were all using different criteria. And so Darwin, when he wrote on the Descent of Man in 1871, described this issue, which I labeled the racial multiplication problem. Now, by the way, you still can't get a decent definition of what a race is in today's society. So if you look at Merriam-Webster's online dictionary, you get three different types of definitions, none of which accurately describe the variation within our species or any species. So I'm going to skip this because I just want to make a couple of points, and then we're going to talk about viruses. Okay, so even though we can clearly see that people have different physical appearances, that is not evidence that these different physical appearances should be classified as racial groups. Now, there are two criteria that modern biologists use: the amount of genetic variation that exists within versus between different groups, and whether groups can be considered unique genetic lineages. So I'm going to start by making clear a point that you may not know. If you take any two people from anywhere in the world and you sequence their genomes, you DNA sequence their genomes, those two people share 99.9% of their DNA in common. That leaves 0.1% that's different. Now, before you get carried away about that 0.1%, the human genome is 3.3 billion base pairs long. So 0.1 of 3.3 billion is still 300 million base pairs. That's a lot to work with. But if you take that 300 million and you break it down with regard to where these different variants can exist in the world, 85% of them exist everywhere. So now you're down to 15%. Of that 15%, 10% is unique to continental regions like Africa or Europe or Eurasia or Far East. And of that remains, 5% is unique to specific regions within continents. So this explains how DNA ancestry companies can come up with ways to tell you where your ancestry came from. That doesn't mean that human beings are biological races. It just says that there's enough differences between people that accumulated after they left Africa. Now, I want to be really clear about this. Human beings evolved in Africa. Now, I also want to be really clear about this thing, okay? I am a confirmed baptized Christian, okay? I find absolutely no discord between my faith and my science. Now, some people do. And so I wrote a paper last year about how out of Africa really threatens the faith of some people because they want to believe that the Garden of Eden was somewhere in Europe. Okay. However, all the scientific evidence tells us that human beings started in Africa. They did not start in Europe. They did not start in the Middle East. They didn't start in the New World. They started in Africa. So anyway, after people left Africa, they began to accumulate genetic differences, but the genetic differences are tiny compared to the overall human genome. Now, there are statistical ways to measure the differences in those genome, and I'm not going to go into derivation of that because I know that not everybody's taking college level genetics. But what I can show you is that if we compare the amount of genetic variation in human groups, it's very small. So the black bar on this diagram represents globally human variation. And it doesn't rise to the level of where we would say that people have biological races. We clearly have geographically based genetic differences, but we don't have enough variation to say that people are sufficiently different from each other to say that they are really belong to different racial groups. Now, if you move to the right, there are animals that do have races, like coyotes from North America, or elephants from Eastern and South Africa, or white-tailed deer, or Gramps gazelle from Kenya. There are large-bodied mammals that do form biological races. We haven't. And the reason we haven't is because we are a young species that has always had sufficient amounts of movement between human populations and breeding between those populations to keep us uniform. So when we look at genetic variation at the level of our DNA sequences, it's tiny. it's extremely small, which goes back to that 99.1% that I talked about earlier. So there are some barriers to this gene flow, such as deserts like the Sahara, the Himalayan mountains, oceans, but human beings have always been very good about getting around the world. So we found ways across deserts, we found ways over mountains, we found ways across oceans. And so we've always been connected and therefore did not diverge in our gene frequencies enough to be considered races. Now, if you look at that divergence, it's continuous. In other words, this diagram below shows you continuous change in gene frequencies in human groups across the world. They're not clusters, they're not clumped, they're not spaced apart, they're continuous. So any time or any place that you would try to say this group is a race or that group is a race or that group is a race is entirely arbitrary. And if you can't really justify where you're trying to draw these distinctions, then the distinctions are not real. They're simply not real. So quickly then, okay. Yeah, I'm gonna stop with this because again, we could go on with this all night. So now I'm going to switch to talking quickly about COVID and why we need to be concerned. Okay, so some of you may have seen this letter that I wrote to family. Okay, and this was in response to some statements that I'd heard circulating around the family about the SARS-CoV-2 virus and vaccination. So I wanted to be sure that people understood that this virus is dangerous. It can kill you, okay? And if it doesn't kill you, it can make you sick for the rest of your life. And that vaccination is the way to defeat this virus. So how much time do I have? How much time do I have left before you want to go to the conversation?
You can keep going. Keep going. Okay, you're fine.
Okay, I'm fine. All right. So what I wanted people to know, first off, is that, I wasn't just anybody telling them that they should get vaccinated. So very early on in this pandemic, I began to outline what the dangers were. So I appeared on Roland Martin Unfiltered, and I began to explain that if we didn't get this pandemic under control soon, that we would soon be facing a more dangerous and more transmissible virus. So I was telling them that back in March of 2020. And as each stage of the pandemic got worse, they kept calling me back and I would predict the next stage of the pandemic and it would get worse, just like I said it was going to. Now, okay. You can actually follow the course of the evolution of the virus on this website. And I know I've sent this letter to my cousin, so you can all have a chance to look at it.
Also posted on our Facebook page under this event, this exact letter that you sent.
Good. Now, one of the things I also wanted people to know is that African-American scientists have been on this case from the beginning. So this is not a case of just European American or white experts saying this has to be done or that has to be done. Okay, African-American scientists like myself, like my colleague, Dr. Paul Turner, like Dr. Kitzmetzia Corbett from UNC Chapel Hill, now at the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Disease. She actually helped to design the Moderna vaccine. So we've been engaged in this from the very beginning. But one of the things I want to make clear to people is how dangerous this situation can become. And to do that, I want to contrast SARS coronavirus now, which I rate as a level 3 pandemic. So think about pandemics like hurricanes. There's level 3 hurricanes, which are bad, but then there's level 5 hurricanes like Katrina that are disastrous. So SARS coronavirus 2 right now is a level 3 pandemic. It is not as bad as it can get. The influenza pandemic of 1919, which lasted for 4 years. In its first wave was mainly killing older people and people with pre-existing conditions. Does that sound familiar? In the second wave, it was killing everyone. So by the time it was done in 4 years, it killed 100 million people worldwide.
Excuse me 1 second.
Yeah.
Can everybody just mute your phones or your computers so that we don't get the background noise? Thank you. Someone needs to,
Steve.
yeah, Steve and Joyce,
Yes.
mute your phones or your computers, whatever you're
Wait a
on.
minute, mute. Okay. Yeah.
There we
Okay,
go.
thank you.
Okay, so the second wave was killing everybody. So it's entirely possible that SARS coronavirus 2 can find the variants it needs to start killing everybody in the second wave. Now, it hasn't happened yet. So let me tell you how dangerous this is. So I did a calculation. Now, this is a calculation I did back on January 4th. In one study, they found the average patient who dies from COVID has about 134 billion viruses per milliliter of their blood. Now, a person weighing 150 to 180 pounds has 1.5 gallons of blood, or 4,500 milliliters. So that meant on January 4th, with the number of infected people at 20 million plus, if you multiply those numbers, you arrive at the figure 1.24 times 10 to the 22nd power. That is more than the stars in the known universe. Now, if you apply a standard mutation rate to that number of viral particles with their known genome size, you get every possible mutation that could occur has occurred. Which means the longer we allow this virus to grow by people getting infected, the more and more new strains will come up that are more dangerous and more transmissible. So here I was getting my shot a couple of weeks ago, because this is the only way that we are going to be able to stop that from happening. In other words, we have to do mass vaccination as soon as we possibly can. Otherwise, there is the potential that some of these variants will escape the vaccines. Right now, the Pfizer vaccine seems to be keeping pace. The Moderna vaccine seems to be keeping pace. We don't know whether the Johnson & Johnson vaccine will, because we haven't, deployed it yet. Now, the good thing about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is that it's a one-shot vaccine. And that's going to increase the rate at which people can get vaccinated. It also doesn't require storage at -96 like the Pfizer vaccine does. So it's going to be easier to deploy. Now, it's slightly less effective than Moderna and Pfizer, but when you balance that against how quickly it can be deployed, particularly for mobile areas where people don't have access to hospitals and doctors' offices, this could be a game changer. So, end of the day, we must get people vaccinated as soon as possible. Now, some people have come up with a bunch of scientifically incorrect claims about vaccination. So I'm going to deal with each one of them quickly. Number one, the vaccine has not been tested properly, and the vaccine does not protect you from COVID-19. It only lessens the symptoms. That's absolutely incorrect. Okay, the vaccines prevent you from coming down with COVID. Okay, now of the people who did come down with COVID who were vaccinated, the 9 and 5% groups with that should be Pfizer and Moderna, that group had less severe symptoms. So the end of the day is that people aren't dying from COVID if they're vaccinated, and most people don't get sick at all. Next, you can build your immune system up by taking vitamin C, D, zinc, probiotics, blah, 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 blah. You can have the best immune system in the world. It will not help you against SARS coronavirus 2 because SARS coronavirus 2 is a new virus in the human population. So your immune system has never seen it before. So even though you have a strong immune system, if you don't have a memory of that virus in your immune system, it's going to take over and it can kill you. So yes, it's good to have a strong immune system. Definitely you want to build up your immunity, but without vaccination, in other words, that's what vaccination does. It presents your body with the antigen or something that causes your immune system to know when a coronavirus comes along. And if you got a strong immune system, you handle that, you don't get sick. But without vaccination, a strong immune system doesn't help you. Now, the virus was genetically engineered as a bioweapon. Now, the evidence that we currently have shows that this virus jumped from a hybrid from the pangolin and bat to humans. Now, this happens all the time with viruses. The H1N1 influenza started out in birds and pigs and then jumped to humans. Because the viruses don't really care what kind of body they replicate in. Okay, and when you have a lot of virus, some of them are going to have the capacity to infect a new animal that the others can infect. And then it becomes unique to that particular species. Now, are there people doing research on SARS coronaviruses that could lead to biological weapons? And the answer to that is yes. So even though this time SARS coronavirus 2 probably didn't escape from a laboratory, there are people doing experiments which I would consider to be unethical and dangerous, where they're attempting to make hybrid viruses and giving them new capacities that they didn't have before. And so this is a process that needs to be stopped. And it turns out that next week, March 5th, I will be speaking with the author of a new book entitled Dead Epidemiologists, where he documents that these experiments are in fact being done, and also that the way that we're currently living leads to a greater danger of pandemics continuing in the future. So if you think that SARS-CoV-2 is the last pandemic you'll see in your lifetime, I think you need to think again. Unless we seriously address how we are living, and particularly how we are doing factory farming, which creates the perfect environment for viruses to recombine their genetic material and then end up jumping into humans, unless we start changing that practice, we are going to be seeing more and more pandemics. And again, some of them are going to be worse than SARS-CoV-2. Now, another claim, news media is lying, they're not telling you the truth. There are dozens of FDA-approved drugs on the market that can fight SARS-CoV-2. And the answer is simply false. I actually work with some of the people at Gilead Biosciences that make the antiviral drug remdesivir. Remdesivir works somewhat against SARS-CoV-2, but it's not particularly effective. And there really aren't a lot of drugs out there that are effective against these viruses, but they're more on the horizon. But you certainly wouldn't build a bioweapon that you didn't have drugs to handle. So that's simply not true. Now, the new nanotechnology is bad for your body. Okay, healthcare workers have already died after taking the vaccine. As far as I know, no one who's taken this vaccine has died from the vaccine. The recent data on side effects of vaccination have come out for the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine. The number of people who have severe allergic reaction to Pfizer is 3.1 per million. The number that have severe reactions to the Moderna vaccine is 1 per million. Now, a lot of you have had your shots already, and you know that when they give you your shot, they ask you to stay there for 15 minutes and you're watched. There's medical staff on site. So if something goes wrong, there are people there to help you. But this only happens 1 out of a million and 3.1 out of a million times. So I calculated again, the chances of you dying from COVID are 60,000 times higher than you having a bad reaction to the vaccine. So I don't know if you're a betting person, but if I had a bet where there's 1 chance in a million that I die and 60,000 times in a million that I die, I'm gonna take the 1 chance that I die. All right, so let me see where we're at. Okay. So the other point I wanted to make is that conspiracy theorists are spreading lies about vaccination and blatant distortions. And once again, they're not randomly spreading these lies and distortions. They're particularly spreading them in Black and brown communities because quite frankly, they want to see us get sick and they want to see us die. So a good friend of mine, a colleague, wrote an article in Psychology Today, Dr. Guy Harrison, and he pointed out how these Trump-based conspiracy theories were being directed at the Black and brown communities. And so the bottom line is we should not fall for this. Vaccinations have saved more lives than any modern technological development other than clean water. Now, when you think about that, that's saying a lot. So anyway, I'm happy, and the documentation for all the stuff I said is in the letter. So I'm happy to stop and take any specific questions that you have.
Wow, Dr. Graves, you enlightened us greatly with a lot of information and a lot of ammunition to address some of these concerns that you mentioned there, because I've heard all of these conspiracies that you were talking about, and this is just wonderful. One question that I had was when you were talking about the theory that there really isn't a race, a different race. We are all the same race, and how the new companies that do a lot of the genetics basically are looking at that small percentage of what makes us different. One of the things about that, though, is they're making an awful lot of money off of that.
Yeah, they are. And by the way, all of them have asked me to endorse their products, and I have endorsed none of them.
Okay. Yeah, because that's what I was about to say. There's so much money to be made there in that 1%. Why do we not hear others truly putting out that theory of saying there's really no difference, people, other than this small percent? Because that's the first time I've ever actually really heard someone put it so articulated so well to say there's really not that many, the difference. And the difference in your genes is so small, it really doesn't make a difference.
All right, so people have been arguing that human beings don't have biological races since Darwin wrote on the Descent of Man in 1871. So this is not a new idea. Mm-hmm. And, as I said, when we made Race, Power of Illusion in 2003, that was before the Human Genome Project. And we were arguing based upon everything we knew about genetics, human beings don't have biological races. Then when Illumina, which is the company that developed next generation sequencing, once they deployed their machine and reduced, let me tell you, the Human Genome Project cost over $100 million. Mm-hmm. Over, I think it was over, the total project was over 20 years.
I could say I proudly participated. 21andMe
as my DNA. The Illumina machine that I have in my lab that does DNA sequencing, the Illumina machine can sequence a human genome, at least the one I have can do it in a week for $1,000. Mm. The high-end Illumina machines could do it in 48 hours for the same price. Mm. And so thousands of human genomes were sequenced after 2005 to 2015. And by that time, it was overwhelming evidence that the amount of genetic variation in our species was very small. And by the way, that's true of most species. The amount of genetic variation in them is quite small. So, there's a reason why people don't hear this. And that's because our society is structured around the reality of race. And so the people who control the media, they don't really want you knowing this. Like, to give you an idea, so when we did the PBS documentary "Race: Power of an Illusion," how many of you guys have actually seen this documentary?
I have not.
Yeah, most of the audience haven't seen it, and that's because when we were on PBS, they put us on at 10 o'clock at night on Sunday. Okay, now we've been using this in our racial equity and diversity training in the Episcopal Church. So it's part of the training we do with all of our ministers and all of our lay people. But quite frankly, very few people are using these materials. Like my book, The Emperor's New Clothes, which, the chairman of human biology at Harvard, who said was the best book ever written on the subject. My book never made the New York Times bestseller list. The highest it ever got was number 100. Never made it in the top 10. A lot of people's books who, are good scholars, don't get me wrong, their books made it up there. But my book didn't. And I think there's a reason for that, which is it tells too much truth and dismantles too many mythologies for which this society is based. So that's why we did this third book with Alan Goodman to see maybe we'll make the New York Times bestseller list finally.
Let's hope. But thank you for answering that. I want to open it up to see if there were any questions that any individuals out in the audience. Please feel free to unmute yourselves if there's questions or things that you would like to ask.
Good afternoon. Good evening, everyone. Go ahead, Sister Ellen.
Yeah, Ronald had his hand up. I was just telling him to go ahead. You're next, Warren.
So I was, listening to the last part of what you were saying about the conspiracy theories and the misinformation in the Black and brown communities. And it's something that I have always kind of paid attention to and kept in the back of my mind that, the quote unquote powers that be, want to keep us broke, sick, and stupid. And they want to keep us to a point where we are constantly taking whatever negative information we can, think of and say, okay, well, they're trying to, get us with this vaccine, or they're trying to do that. And, a lot of people look back to Tuskegee and they try to use that as an example. My question is, as far as our community, and that is not just the churches, but our schools, and amongst our families, just like what you sent the letter, how do we as a community reverse some of that? How do we fight that and fight that that misinformation, those conspiracy theories that are being fed, especially in some of our more urban areas where these people will purposefully not go to a doctor when something's wrong because they feel as though the doctor is going to experiment on them, or that they're using them as guinea pigs for whatever these things are? How do we reverse that way of thinking in order to break us out of that, being broke, sick, and stupid cycle?
All right, so first thing I say is that you need to educate yourself so that you can become, a walking ambassador for critical thinking and education. The second thing I say is that the most powerful institution in the African-American community is the church, which is why, I work with the Greensboro Faith Leaders Alliance. I talk to ministers of all different denominations. That's why I sit on the Racial Equity and Justice Commission of the Episcopal Diocese of North Carolina, because ministers are trusted. And believe me, ministers are trusted. My cousin Ronald is trusted far more than I am, okay? Even though, I have all these degrees after my name, at the end of the day, in our community, we trust our ministers. In fact, I was speaking in New Brunswick. Everybody, I don't want to get his head too big for the screen, but when I was speaking in New Brunswick, everybody was singing your praises because they knew you and they knew your reputation. And so if we want to make change in our communities, then we need to galvanize our ministers and our faith community to start preaching a different kind of gospel than they've been teaching. Now that's going to step on some people's toes. But again, I believe that I've been called to speak truth to power. I don't care if it's power in the church. I don't care if it's power in the state, because I feel that I am doing what is right. And what's right now is we have to call into question the way we've been living. See, we have been facilitating the brokenness of our people. And some of that has come from the pulpit. And those false prophets need to be exposed.
Great.
Bravo. We agree with that. Brother Warren, Brother Poole.
Yes, good evening, everyone. I want to thank you all for being here. Doctor, I thank you especially, Dr. Graves. The question I have is, what is the time span between the first wave and the second wave of the coronavirus? What makes the waves different? Because you have some people saying, especially in the media, that we're already went through the first wave because things were able to open back up and then get shut back down. What is the scientific definition of the first wave and the second wave?
There really isn't a particular scientific definition of when the waves start. You sort of the thing you see in hindsight. But from what I've seen, we haven't finished the first wave yet. So, right now, I would argue with these new variants coming up, we are entering the second wave. And so one of the problems, and again, while I was, that voice in the wilderness, I was telling people all this opening up stuff is nonsense. So in an essay I wrote for Science for the People magazine, which was entitled Their Money, Our Lives, what was driving this desire to open things up was people want to get back to their money. It wasn't that things were safe. And again, who was victimized by trying to open things up? So-called essential workers. Now, who were these essential workers? Black and brown people. So about what happened out in, I think it was Oklahoma City, in the meat packing plants, where people were walking in to work because they could not stay home because they would be fired. So people were taking Tylenol to drop their temperature so that they could get through the temperature monitor and then get back on the floor. And virtually everybody on that shift died from COVID. So when they were talking about, we need to open this up, really what it was saying was that we don't really care because, I'm Donald Trump. If I get sick, I'm going to go get some Regeneron therapy and I'm going to be good. But these poor people, they don't get Regeneron therapy. So for them, it's okay to spread through our community and for our people to die, as long as they get their money.
Yes, that is definitely something to highlight because we see that, and that was truly seen. That we weren't care.
I just want to add to what Dr. Graves said, because that goes into our theme, investing in God, which means we are investing in ourselves versus the fact that those people that had money were only about themselves, investing in themselves to get more money out of it. And so there's a necessity to make sure that people understand this information. And you said the right thing, which is when the individual understands what this is all about, then in fact, can we now become ambassadors? And Dr. Graves, you just gave my wife and I the word we were looking for. We're working on something and you gave us that word, but Linda's got her hand up there. So Linda, mute yourself so you can talk.
Hi, good evening.
Good evening.
I really enjoyed the information. My mother and I were fortunate to get the vaccine, the first one, the Moderna, on Sunday. We're supposed to go back a month and get the second shot. They said it's 10 days or 14 days after the shot that you become, 100% vaccinated. That's the question.
Oh, so that's the question. Yeah. So, right now with the first shot, it turns out that people are performing pretty well with the first shot. The second shot makes it even better, closer to 95, 97%. But, again, we're in a race because right now, the Moderna vaccine was designed to work against the original strains, that came out of China. Okay. But we have new strains. Like there's a strain in California that quickly took over the number of infected people. So there's you've heard about the one in Brazil, you heard about the one in the UK, you heard about the one in South Africa. There's a new one in California. And what I have told people is that we don't actually know what the landscape of these coronavirus variants are in the United States. And the reason we have to be concerned about this is because we have the largest number of people infected in the world, which means we have more opportunities for new things to happen. So I just had a grant, by the way, rejected by the NC Biotech Center, where I and my colleagues wanted to sequence the DNA of coronavirus that we were getting from wastewater on the A&T campus. So we have means, we don't have to go around and find sick people because everybody uses the bathroom. And we have means of extracting the DNA from in this case, the RNA from the virus, okay, and then amplifying it and then sequencing it to see if it matches the old strains.
That sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, no, it's a great idea. But the people, of course, and I hate to say it, but the people who reviewed our grant were basically saying, this is a fantastic idea. Well, how come we didn't think about this? And then they started coming up with all these lame excuses for why they didn't want to give us the money. And at the end of the day, when you got done reading what they were saying, it basically they said, well, we really don't care if you Black people die. It wasn't like your study is wrong. It was like, we have other things we'd rather spend the money on, and Black people is not one of them. That's really what they said. So we're going to go to the National Institutes of Health, and we're going to try to get this funded by them. But we have to start monitoring. Right now, only about 1% to 2% of the patients who have been sick with COVID have had their COVID viruses sequenced. So that means that it's like this. You know about the iceberg? They hit the Titanic. You can see the part above the water, but the majority of the iceberg is below the water. We don't know what's below the water with COVID 2019 right now. We need to start sequencing.
I have a question.
Go ahead,
My
Alex.
sister.
Yeah, this is your sister. So everyone is getting the vaccine. But it appears to me that some people still do not get that we still have to be cautious of wearing the mask, washing our hands, and trying to get others to get vaccinated. What is your suggestion on educating people who really don't get it?
Everybody should be double masking right now. If you're not double masking, you're not protected. So let me make this really clear. Okay, so the one on top was an N95. So I use a disposable one next to my mouth and nose, and then I put an N95 on top of that. And you will note my nose wasn't out. You see people walking around a supermarket with their noses out. That's not protection, and that's not protecting other people. So again, one of the things we talk about in our faith community is about what are the requirements we owe to God, and what are the requirements we owe to other people. The scriptures are very plain about this, right? And Jesus said, love thy neighbor as thyself. And the hard thing about this is so many of these people claim to Christianity. But when it comes to other people, it's really all about them. So even if you aren't a Christian, this is an elementary principle of moral philosophy. You know, you treat like cases alike. If you want to be treated fairly, you treat other people fairly. If you're concerned about your life, you should be concerned about other people's lives.
Absolutely.
Rachel?
Hi, good evening, family. I want to thank JoJo for doing this, Dr. Graves for doing this, because this is something we definitely need. I'm in the DC area, and we have a large Black African-American population, and it's very disturbing when I talk about the vaccine to people and they bring up the things that were mentioned earlier in the call. And I have personally had 2 of the Pfizer doses myself, so I try to talk from a personal perspective about the importance of getting the vaccine. So I just have one comment and one quick question. My comment is, if you know anybody in your village where there's an older people, just please help try to reach out. Maybe this was mentioned again, I was a little late on the call. Help anybody in your village, drive them to an appointment, get on the computer. I had got on the computer in New Jersey with my mother, 5 different lists. My mother was not in any, I mean, you know, she's in her 70s to start pulling the internet. She can do email, but not much, you know, the type of thing. So if you know anybody you can help out in your village, in your community, please, please help an older person get on the list. And a lot of lists in this area, you can put your own personal email and your phone number, and they will contact you, and then you can, you know, advocate for the elderly person in your village. That's my first comment. And my question, JoJo, is I did get 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine, and I had very little side effects after the second vaccine, where I'm hearing many people that got Pfizer and Moderna have had really, you know, fever, have really been just having a hard time. So if your body doesn't produce much of a reaction after your second dose, are you less covered, or were you potentially exposed, or is it just how vaccines work?
That's just how vaccines work. Some
Okay.
people have, you know, more severe side effects, and some people breeze through. So, and when I say to people about, you know, having a couple of days where you feel like you have the flu, that is a whole lot better than being dead.
Absolutely. I know people have had fevers, chills, vomiting. They, you know, after 36 hours, it went away, but I had hardly no side effects after the second dose. I was just wondering. Thank you.
Yeah, and the other point you made, Rachel, is also really important. You know, the way vaccination has been set up, once again, favors wealthy, middle-class white people.
Yep.
The way the you know, portals have been set up, you know, if you have internet access and your internet works, you're much more likely. Now, I can tell you from a colleague that works in Duke Hospital, this is what he told me. He said, you know, when I go through the COVID ward, all I see is Black and brown bodies. When I go to the vaccine line, all I see is white bodies. We already know from the data, okay, that right now the rate of vaccination of Black and brown bodies is only about 1/3 of that of white bodies.
That's correct.
Okay, and again, that's because the way the portals have been set up favor people who have internet access and have education. And so you're absolutely right. What Rachel said about helping older people, helping people without internet access, you know, that's what we've been doing down here. You know, I sit on the Episcopal Church's COVID vaccination task force. That's what we've been doing. We've been having ministers help people get registered. We have lay people help people get registered who don't know how to work the phone or don't know how to work the portal. You know, you have to do that because right now, okay, we're in a race. We've got to get people vaccinated as soon as we possibly can before variants start escaping the vaccine. And if you didn't hear it from anybody else, I'm going to tell you that that's going to happen. So the more people we get vaccinated, the more lives we will save.
Are there ways we can volunteer to help people? Do we have to go door to door? What's the best way for us to reach those individuals who we're describing right now? I think, as you talked about, the church was always that place that if you didn't know what else to do, you know, I grew up in an area where everything that at a time when you needed something or you wanted something, you went to your church. So how can the church now turn back into that that place of helping others? What suggestions do you have for us?
Well, again, it's hard for me to know, what the organization of your church is compared to other Baptist ministries. Now, I know there's National Baptist Convention. I'm assuming that you all belong to National Baptist Convention. So the first question I would ask is, have you had an emergency COVID vaccination task force meeting of the National Baptist Convention in your area? So you have, or have?
No, they have not that I know of.
No.
All right, so I would tell you that's the first thing you need to do. And again, if you would like me to get on Zoom as a scientific expert to support the efforts, I'm happy to do it. I'm doing it for Baptist ministers in Wake Forest soon as well. Because I mean, I don't care. I'll go across denominational lines because we're talking about saving people's lives right now.
Yeah.
And so the way we're doing it in our church is, we have ministers who have congregations, and they know who's in their congregation, and they know who needs help, and they know who doesn't need help. And so they're focusing on the people that they know. And so I would say that's where you need to start. You know who's in your ministry, you know who's likely to be able to use the computer and who isn't, and you should focus on the ones that you know can't do it yet. And if you could get together a consortium of ministers, then you can get to more people, and you can bring together more resources to get to those people as soon as you possibly can.
Okay. Are they giving the vaccine out to churches and having it set up like they did at the First Baptist Church of Lincoln Gardens over here in Somerset? They had 3,000 doses sent directly from the White House to the church so they can target the Black population, because they did everything else.
Yeah, what we're doing in Greensboro is we're using North Carolina A&T, because we have something you guys don't. We have historically Black universities. So the place you saw me getting my shot was the Alumni Center at North Carolina A&T. And so we had people from Cone Health there, and we had the whole setup.
Yeah, the whole setup.
We volunteered all of our churches in the Episcopal Diocese to be vaccination centers, but as you know, the shortcoming is the presence of vaccine. So you can volunteer your church, but if you ain't got any vaccine,
you ain't got the vaccine. Yeah.
And the other thing, of course, with the Moderna vaccine, you got to be able to store it at -4. The Pfizer requires -96. Now, it'll stay good for a limited period of time, not at those temperatures, so that, it's harder to administer that. So hopefully, once the J&J vaccine starts rolling off the production line, that doesn't need to be stored in only one shot. And again, if you get your churches organized, I think they can make a huge difference in terms of being a place where people will go because they trust you, and you can easily get them vaccinated.
Well, now we got two questions.
Johnson will be announcing on the 25th when we will actually be releasing to everyone. So stay tuned, a couple of days.
All right, so we have two. We have Ronald, and then we have Brother Poole. Now, for those that are on, and I don't see any other hands up, but we're going to have Dr. Graves back again because I think it's worthwhile, and he's given a lot of information for us to do and to work. Everybody work your network and do that. So let's go with Ronald, let's go with Warren, and then Connie, we want to close it out.
Sure.
So my question, going back to the topic that was brought up of opening things back up, and in relation also to the variants that we're seeing, and how quickly, we went from just, what we knew as the main COVID-19 to now the variants that are coming from various places, including that we're finding here in the States. We've been hearing a lot about being able to successfully open up schools and successfully run our education systems in the United States without, any major issues or anything like that. And, for instance, right now, my wife's a teacher, and she's been teaching from home, and her school is projecting for her to be back in the building on March 15th, the students to be back in April 15th. And she's teaching in a predominantly Black neighborhood. And she's now, I had to advise her she needs to go to her union rep to push for vaccines. However, current administration and possibly previous administration as well have advised that, teachers can go back into the school without being vaccinated. Also, we have the fact that children are not even on the spectrum of being vaccinated or tested. And we all know how it goes with a lot of these schools. The parents don't want to vaccinate their children. So my question with all of this going on is, how successfully can we enter back into the school system? How successfully can we go back to teaching our children in a classroom if, one, not everybody's being vaccinated, two, variants are being popped up, and we look at the mass crowding that we have, especially in Black and brown communities, where you can try to put them 6 feet apart, but some of those buildings are so old they weren't designed for that. And if you tried to put more than 20 kids in there at 6 feet apart, they'd be hanging out the windows. How successful is it? How successful a possibility are we looking at to get our education system back up to running before the end of the school year?
So I stopped my background on purpose because I'm embarrassed about my office that I'm currently in. Okay, so I understand exactly what you're talking about. The building I'm in, so old, probably saw Moses walking through the halls at one point. So I know, exactly what you're talking about. And again, this goes back to these protocols being developed for white, middle class, upper middle class people. And so once again, we're in a situation where if you apply that protocol to Black and brown communities, you are asking for a disaster. And so number one, I say no teacher should be going into the classroom until they have been vaccinated.
Well, they are being threatened with job loss. Like my
that's
wife,
where you have a union, and that's where you go
Yeah.
on strike.
Yeah.
Because you can't do it as an individual.
Yeah.
Now,
Oh, yeah. Without a doubt.
I used to be a shop steward for the American Federation of Teachers. So I've been involved in leading us. I led the strike at the University of Michigan. Okay, Black Action Movement too. Most people don't know that history. So at the end of the day is the union has to stand up for its workers. And in doing so, brings into focus the sharp disparity between the conditions in Black and brown communities and those of wealthy white ones. Because you're absolutely right. To be able to do social distancing in those old inadequate schools with massive, overcrowding of students in the classroom, that's insane. And nobody should have to die because of these, over promises that are being made about what you can do in the schools. Now, the flip side of that coin is that because of this distance learning and the digital divide, which we've been talking about, Black and brown students are falling behind because they're not being able to get the instruction they need. So, but again, this comes to, social norms about, when is somebody supposed to finish school? Okay, so if this year is a wash, let it be a wash for everybody. I mean, they can finish school 1 year in addition because the pandemic was really bad 1 year. There's no reason to speed everything up, particularly if with the new variants, you could create the condition where a new variant pops up and all these teachers aren't vaccinated and all these kids are in crowded conditions, and all of a sudden you've got another hotspot that you didn't anticipate.
Yeah.
So my position is teachers don't go back until they've been vaccinated.
Amen.
Brother Warren, you're going to be the last question for today.
Okay, thank you. Again, I thank you, Dr. Graves. The question I actually just wanted to piggyback off the statement that Sister Sharon Allen made about getting the word out there and through the churches. We come together for concerts, we come together with stars. One of the things I was just sitting here, because I do fundraisers so much for my job, and it helps to get the word out for different things, because I work in an infectious disease clinic. So one of the things I was just sitting here thinking about when she said that was to give you some space in prime time and maybe have a concert or something to raise money for that space with a few churches to let them know this is the purpose. The healing of the Black folks, the Black community, starts with the church. So I'm looking at maybe some kind of concerts with a few stars that are willing to donate their time. They can be all over the country, simultaneously. And once the money is raised, we find some time for you to sit down on prime time, maybe in 2 hour special or something, to give this information out. to the community. Maybe somewhere in there as well, have a few stars, a few singers sing to keep people's attention. Either you speak first and let them do a concert again after you. That way to keep people's attention.
Well, my feeling is that, again, the Black wealthy community can and should be doing more for Black poor folks. Okay, because there's a lot of people whose wealth is generated off selling their songs to Black poor kids. Okay, and they could be putting more of that money back into the Black community. So if you can find, these stars that are willing to do a concert, and I'm sure you're talking about a virtual concert, because obviously we can't bring people into buildings right now. But if you can find those people who are willing to do that concert to bring these issues to the forefront in larger sectors of the African American community, I am happy not just to bring myself, but other renowned African American scientists to speak about various aspects, and medical doctors to speak about various aspects of this pandemic from the perspective of how it's impacting the African American community, because I know the right people to ask. So if you can get those people to be willing to donate their time and raise money, I can get the people to speak.
It sounds like a project for not just me, maybe for a Pilgrim the whole to look at. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, for those who did not attend today, they missed the word. Not only did we put it in some biblical terms in there, but you also put in some health terms that I think we all needed to hear, and we need to go out and we need to spread the word and the message of what we learned today. And as Pastor said, we would love to have you back at a later date for our series. Because this, as we said, this is going to be a year-long series that we are doing. For February, we have done it every week, but we are going to move to a smaller cycle where we're doing it once a month. But for our next coming cycles, we will be focusing on health. The first one be in March, we will be focusing on diabetes, and we may even focus on heart disease as well in March, if we can get that done. But we're going to switch from being weekly to maybe bi-weekly or once monthly. But like I said, we're going to keep this up. We're going to continue to invest in ourselves so we can invest in God. So please continue to support us, everyone. Continue to spread the word about our sessions. Thank you so much for attending. This recording will be posted for those who were not able to, if you missed part of it or you want to share it with others, please do so. And I hope you really, really got something out of today's message, because there was so much that Dr. Graves imparted us with today that you can take, that you can share, and especially those myth-busting things that he said, because we know we've all heard these things in our community, in our circles. Let's get out there and let's spread the word that we need to be vaccinated and we need to take care of our own community first. Thank you, Dr. Graves.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
And it's not if, it's when we can get you back and your schedule is agreeable.
I always have time for my family. So that's
all right. Well, we're going to get you back, because my goal is within the next week or so is to start calling out to pastors across the board, every denomination, and to set up for them to come on to a Zoom and let you just spread some of that stuff that you gave to us tonight, because you said it, and it's so true that there are so many people that are out there and that are pastoring, and all they're talking about is money. They're talking about everything else but, and the health, physical health of a person is as important as the spiritual health of the person, which goes along with the mental health. So we applaud you. We thank you. We're just filled with so much that you did tonight. And I think everybody that was on here, if you just spread the word to tell them to go on to Pilgrim's Facebook page, it'll be on there, and it will be on Pilgrim's YouTube page as well. So again, thank you so much We love you and looking forward to having you soon.
God bless.
God bless
Thank
you
you.
all.
God bless you. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.